So let me introduce myself. I'm Patrick Alexander. I'm English. I've been teaching wine appreciation here in South Florida for about 12 years. I started at in fact, the whole idea started at the University of Miami. And then since then, I've been doing it at Books and Books in Coral Gables and next door at the Coral Gables Museum. I left England, and I'm not a trained sommelier. My main qualification is that I've been drinking wine for nearly 70 years now. So, and I have a very large nose for smelling the aromas. So I left England in my early 20s. I moved to France, to the Bordeaux region, and got married and raised my children there, surrounded by all the vineyards of Bordeaux. We then moved to northern Italy, to the Swiss-Italian border on Lake Lugano, where we were surrounded by the vineyards of Piedmont with the Barolos and the Barbarescos, all the great Nebbiolo grapes, which we'll be talking about later. And then when we came to America in 1980, we moved to Santa Cruz in California, and California and Santa Cruz were surrounded by Bonnie Doon, by David Bruce, wonderful, wonderful vineyards. So most of my adult life has obviously been spent surrounded by vineyards and drinking wine. One has to do that. And for the past 30 years, we've lived in Florida, South Florida, here in Coral Gables. I have to tell you, and that's why I'm here, South Florida is the best place in the world for people who love wine. Why? Well, the reason is we don't grow any wine ourselves. We have Schnepplis a little further south of Miami where they make fruit wine, but we don't have any wine, great wine ourselves. Therefore, we have to bring it in from elsewhere. We have obviously American wine. We have access to the Californian wines and Finger Lakes, New York and Oregon and Washington. Because of our geographical position, we have direct access to the wines of South America, Argentina and Chile. And with a large European population here, we have access to all the French and Italian and German wines. So you would think that they're all trying, because we have none of our own, we have to bring it in, and the suppliers are very happy to provide us with product. And I didn't mean to mention that, a little bit of shameless plugging here. I'm also the author of The Book Lover's Guide to Wine, which you can get at Books and Books or Amazon. We don't like to mention that here in Coral Gables. And some people have asked me, where did I get the information on cheese? This is a friend of mine who wrote this book, and that's where I got all the ideas. Can you read it? It's Cheese by Liz Thorpe. But you know, all this talk about wine, let's get into it. That's why we're here. So tonight we are having Brunello de Montalcino. We're going to talk about that a bit later. But for the moment, I just want you to think about this as red wine. We'll talk about where it comes from, how it was made, what's the significance a bit later. But for the moment, let's just use our senses and just think, do we like it? How does it smell? How does it taste? I opened my bottle about 15 minutes ago. Consequently, I'm not getting much on the nose, but I'm getting a sort of earthiness from it. It's very soft, it's not biting, which quite often a strong red wine, when you first pour it, there's a tingling on the tongue. It's the tannins that will attack you. I'm not getting that. What we're going to do throughout these all 6 weeks is we'll open the wine straight away. We'll have our first taste, and then throughout the evening, we'll do it again and again. And I hope what you're going to find is that the wine really changes over the 1 hour that we're together. And that's because the oxygen is getting to it. But again, we'll discuss that later. So let's go back to this conundrum of me saying that Florida, South Florida, is the best place in the world for wine lovers. As I said, when we started our married life, we lived in Bordeaux, and we were surrounded by the great wines of Bordeaux at very reasonable prices compared to what you pay now. The Margots, the Lafittes, the Pechamont, but that's all we could drink. That's all they had. We couldn't even get a Burgundy when we lived in France. Burgundy, c'est en anglais, what do they know? And had we lived in Burgundy, of course, they would have been very disdainful about the wines of Bordeaux. When we moved to Italy, there again, as I mentioned, we were surrounded by wonderful vineyards and the Nebbiolo grapes and the big wines of Barolo and Barbaresco, but that's all we could get. There were no French wines. There were certainly no American wines, and not even really any wines from southern Italy. And then we came to California. In California, we had, I remember it was called, there was a big store that with a wine emporium, fabulous wines, everything from Sonoma and Napa Valley, but nothing, very few from Europe. They had to acknowledge a few from Europe, but basically it was the Californian wines. I didn't know about Oregon wines or Washington State wines until I came here to South Florida. And that's because we don't have any wines here, so we bring them in from all over the world. Let's see how it's maturing. The bing, by the way, is, I believe, late arrivals. I'm hoping that they're coming in automatically. Oh, they're... Okay. Now they're all in. So we have 32 people, which is fine. And Dylan wants to come back in. Come on. Go in your corner. Be good. Now, of course, things have changed. Where we lived in France over 30 years ago, and for example, this is a catalogue put out by Leclerc, which is the equivalent of Costco Total Wine. Well, need to be muted, I think. Mute all. Sorry about that. Allow participants to unmute themselves. No, certainly not. Okay, so...
Oui, on va sur le catalogue de Leclerc.
Alfredo Carton, you so this is a catalogue that's now put out in France, and it's wonderful. It's got hundreds of wines, really good wines, wonderful prices. There's what, 115 pages of wines, but you know what? They're all French. If you're living in France, this is your choice. French wines. Despite the the European Economic Union, there's no Italian wines. They're very disdainful of Italian wines anyway in France. There's no German wines. There's certainly no American wines. And that's the same problem in Italy. That's the same problem, as I mentioned, in California. Alfredo, I think you need to, you keep popping up, and I'm sorry, I'm not technical enough to know what you're doing wrong. So therefore, South Florida, because it doesn't grow any of its own wines, is the best place to be a wine lover. I'm now going to try so hopefully you can all see my first PowerPoint slide. This is not, I haven't gone to Total Wines, I haven't gone to a wine emporium, I've just gone to a local grocery store, and this is a typical site that you will see in American, well, certainly in South Florida. And look at our choice. We've got them from California, from Oregon, we've got them from Australia, from the Southern Hemisphere, we've got them from all over Europe. We're spoiled for choice. And that's what I mean by saying that living here in South Florida, we probably have a bigger choice of selection of wines than anywhere else in the world. And because we have a lot of South Americans, wine lovers, and European wine lovers as well as American wine lovers, the demand is there, and the rest of the world is very keen to sell to us at competitive prices. Now, I do apologize, I was a little bit snooty, a little bit English, if you like, about Schnebli's wine earlier. I didn't mean to be degrading. There we go. Uh-oh, technical problems here. There we go. So Schnebli's makes, two people have entered the waiting room for this meeting. These latecomers, it's terrible. Admit all. Schnebli's makes, I'm sorry about Dylan, I thought he was going to be well behaved. I won't let him in any more classes. Schnebli's makes fruit wines, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm sure a lot of them are very delicious. But the point of our program and what we're talking about are grape wines, and not only grape wines, because those grow, there are all many different types all over the world. We are talking about Vitis vinifera. And Vitis vinifera, as we'll see next week when we go through the history of wine, started off in the Caucasus Mountains, and that is the parent, if you like, of all the wines that we drink. Now, I've divided it here into two types. The international varietals, I call them international varietals because you get them all over the world. If you go to Australia, if you go to Argentina, if you go to anywhere in Europe, you will get Cabernet Sauvignon, you'll get Merlot, Pinot Noir, you'll get Chardonnay, partly because European bias, that is the Europeans who originally went off and planted them, the vineyard owners, but it's also their forgiving grapes. They will grow well, pretty much anywhere. As opposed to what I'm also on the other side calling regional varietals. And those are grapes which, yes, it's possible to grow them probably anywhere in the world, but they really identify with a certain region. The Albarino, for example, is the grape of northwest Spain, just above the Portuguese border. And the Albarinos from there are unique. And if you have an Albarino from anywhere else, it'll always be a disappointment. In the same way, for example, Malbec. Malbec originally came from near Bordeaux, but it's really come into its magnificence high, above 5,000 feet in the Andes in Argentina. And really nobody else tries to compete with Malbec anywhere else in the world, because the Argentinians, they're the only ones who have 5,000 to 10,000 feet of vineyards to grow them. Cahors, which is near Bordeaux, is where the Malbec grape originally came from, and they still use it, and that's an interesting thing we might discuss later, of comparing a Malbec from Cahors and a Malbec from Argentina. Nebbiolo, I've mentioned earlier, that was from the northeast of Italy, where my family and I lived for many years. We drank it regularly. It's now become very expensive, I'm afraid. And let's go down to the blue. The blue means the white wines, as the red means the red wines. The Torrontés. Torrontés is from Argentina, from northern Argentina, quite getting close to the equator. And that is a magical wine. It grows so high, 10,000 feet. It's close to the equator, so in the daytime the temperatures are 100 degrees, and at nighttime they fall way below 40. So there's this variation, whatever it is, whatever the magic is, can't be replicated anywhere else. And the Torrontés grape, the Torrontés wine, which is very reasonably priced, by the way, I do recommend. But this evening we're drinking Brunello di Montalcino, which is made from the Sangiovese grape. The Sangiovese grape was first discovered by the Romans, and in fact it means Sangiovese, the blood of Jove. Jove was the head boss man, chief god. But if we look at our label on the bottle, it doesn't mention Sangiovese anywhere. That's because this comes from Tuscany, and in Tuscany, well, Montalcino is a village in Tuscany, but all the wines in Tuscany, all the red wines in Tuscany, are made with Sangiovese. So there's no need to say that on the label. Let me, I guess this isn't working. What makes great wine? That's what I wanted to discuss next. What makes this so special that we're paying $24 for this one and $5 for another one? The main thing that makes grapes wine is the grape and the sun. The grapes are growing. The sun turns the inside of them into sugar. And as we'll see later, when they're fermented, the sugar turns into alcohol. But you can't grow grapes everywhere. They're basically in a band around the earth between 30 degrees and 50 degrees from the equator. That's both south of the equator and north of the equator. And what I've done here in this slide, which I hope you can see, is, whoops, go back, is show the range, and I think this is very interesting. So from the north, the furthest away from the equator, we've got Moselle in Germany, 49 degrees north. And in the further south, we have 34 degrees north, which was Beirut and Santa Barbara in California. And in between, it's quite interesting to see, because we live here in South Florida, we think of Seattle as being somewhere north of the North Pole, but actually it's at 47 degrees north on the same latitude as Chablis in France. And Chablis is where quite often you might want to go for your summer holidays and get a bit of sun. Let's think of Quebec in Canada. That's on the same latitude as Dijon. The center of the Burgundy in France. What I find interesting, later we're going to be having the final class, we're going to have a Primitivo. And Primitivo, as we'll discuss at the time, is the same as Zinfandel. It's exactly the same grape, it's just a different name. And what's interesting here is that if you see 39 degrees north, Mendocino, California, is the same latitude as Puglia, which is in the heel of Italy in the south. And Zinfandel grows best in Mendocino, and Primitivo grows best in Puglia. So there's a nice contrast there. And the other thing, tonight we are having it's the Barolo, but it's the same as, it's from Tuscany, which is Chianti. So that's 40 degrees north. Anyway, so that's the first thing that defines how we get good wines. The next thing is elevation. So if you remember, let's go back, and Moselle in Germany, 49 degrees north, as opposed to, Santa Barbara, 34 degrees north. So if you're closer to the equator, the sun is beating down. But as you move further away from the equator, the sun is always going to be at an angle. And the sun is the essential part of making wine, of turning the grape into sugar, with which we're going to make alcohol. So therefore, as you get further and further away from the equator, so you need to be on an elevation so that the sun can come in sideways. So in Germany, for example, which is furthest away from the equator of all the other places in Europe, all the vineyards are on riverbanks facing south. This photograph here shows the Moselle River, and you can see how steep it is. That's so that it gets a maximum sun on it. The other thing you might notice is it's pretty stony and not what you call fertile, as opposed to, I can't really point, but you can see the other side of the river, and we know this from our from school, that the Mississippi River, as it winds around, all the flat bits are full with all the earth which has come down, so it's really rich and fertile. And that part across from the river here that we see in this photograph, I'm sure is great for growing tulips and strawberries, and because it's rich black soil. Terrible for wine. The reason being that if you planted vineyards on the other side of the river, they would just sit and think, oh, this is nice, and they'd bring up all the nutrients from the thick black earth, and you get great big juicy grapes, which would taste like nothing. Whereas on this side of the river, getting the maximum amount of sun that the poor Germans are allowed, the vines have to press down deep into the soil, fighting down. This is probably granite, so they need water, and in order to get the water, they need to push deep into the earth as far as possible to get the water. And then when the water comes up to the vine, it's passing through all the minerals here and bringing up. So the vines, for a start, the roots are strong, but the main thing is the roots are bringing in all the tastes, all the minerals that make the wine so interesting. And that's why the wines of the Moselle in particular are, and that's why you need thin topsoil. And those of you who've been to vineyards probably remember you being underawed by the beauty of the soil. You don't plant vineyards where there's nice rich soil. You plant vineyards places where the roots really have to fight to get the flavors. So deep drainage. Then the other thing, of course, is the climate. And up in northern Germany, as opposed to southern France, there's an obvious difference in climate, the difference between Oregon and Santa Barbara. We all know that. Therefore, the different types of grapes that you plant, some grapes like a lot of rain, some grapes don't like rain at all, some need a late frost, some need an early frost. They all have different demands. So that comes down to varietal, the type of grape. And we're going to discuss this in a bit more detail, but basically in Europe, we've had 3,000 years of knowing which particular grape works in this particular sort of soil, this sort of climate, whereas in the New World, and forgive me for not being condescending at all, but the New World of America, particularly California, Australia, South America, you're still experimenting to find out which grapes work best where. And what that all comes down to, what we call the posh way of saying it, is varietal or terroir. Those are two French terms. Varietal means type of grape, and terroir means where it's come from. The best way of explaining it, let's see how this is progressing, by the way. Do feel free to, I'm wandering around waving my hands. You have the advantage of being at home, so you can be holding your glass, and the heat from your hand is warming it, which improves, which makes the, and we'll discuss this a bit more in a minute, which makes the aromas rise up. So I'm getting much more in my nose than I did before. I'm getting earthy tones. It's still very soft. I mean, this is a big wine. By big, I mean it's got a full body. So I was expecting more tannins, and tannins. On the other hand, this wine is 7, but we'll discuss this wine in more detail in a moment. But it's 7 years old, so it has aged. Sorry. So the best way to describe the difference between varietal and terroir is to discuss a conference that was held in London, an imaginary conference actually, held in London by the British, and they invited people from all over the world to discuss, I don't know, the decline in democracy. And the English being, odd the way they are, they had all their delegates there, but they said, we're having this dinner tonight, but it's only men. And the women, the wives have to stay in the hotel rooms. So they had the dinner, and at the end of the evening, I'm talking about a French guest and an American guest. The French guest came back to his hotel and to his to see his wife in their room, and she said, "Chérie, how was your meal tonight?" And he said, "Well, English cuisine, but I must say the wines were fabulous. First of all, we had a delicious Sancerre. Then, with the main course, we had a Romanée Conti. And finally, we ended with an awesome Chateau d'Yquem." Now, the American, when he got back to his room, and his wife said, "Hey, honey, how'd it go?" He said, "Well, honey, that fancy English cooking, there were no hamburgers at all, but the wine was great. We started off with a Sauvignon Blanc from France, and then we had a superb French Pinot Noir, and finally an awesome French Semillon." Now, the two men had the same meal, drank the same wines, and they were both telling the truth. It's just that for not only a Frenchman, but an Italian, any European, the terroir, where the wine came from, is what was important. And he wouldn't even, most European, I didn't really know the difference between different grapes until I came to America. It's where the wine comes from. And there's 3,000 years of history behind that to say that, for example, wine number 2, the Romanée Conti, that's a Pinot Noir, and you only get Pinot Noirs in Burgundy. Now, for the American, it wasn't an ignorant man, and it's simply two different ways of looking at things. And for the American, what was important and what he wanted to convey and share with his wife was the type of grape that they were drinking. And of course, the two women were simply delighted that their husbands had had a really good evening and hadn't gone off to the strip bars with all the other men. That was the main thing there. So that's the difference between terroir and varietal. Now we're closing in on the wine we're drinking this evening. And this ties in with terroir and varietal. So, as I said, the Brunello de Montalcino that we're drinking tonight comes from Tuscany. And in Tuscany, which is that area in northern Italy, the only red grape permitted is Sangiovese. Sangiovese is one of the oldest grapes, so named. It was named by the Romans, and it actually means San Giovese, meaning blood of Jove, the chief god. And all the wines in Tuscany, all the red wines in Tuscany, are made with the Sangiovese grape. I mentioned earlier that my wife and I had lived in northern Italy, in Piedmont, on the Swiss-Italian border, and up there the grape is Nebbiolo. But the famous wines from that region are Barbaresco or Barolo, for example, and those are names of villages, small towns in that region. And there's a difference between Barbaresco and Barolo, and there was a time back then when I could tell the difference between them. But they're both made with the same grape, Nebbiolo. Later in this class, I think it's class number 5, we're going to be having an Amarone, and that's from northeast Italy. And again, it's just made there. And then if you go with our final class, we'll be having a Primitivo, and that comes from the southern part of Italy, in Puglia. So over the centuries, with the 3,000 years of history, and I've been snobbish of it, it's just a fact, 3,000 years, the Europeans have found out that this grape grows well here, and this grape doesn't grow well there. And that's why I'm going to let Dylan in, because he's going to make a lot of noise. Come on then. Over there. Be good. So there. That's Dylan. This is Tuscany. And as you can see, all the grapes, all the wines that come out of Tuscany, all the red wines that come out of Tuscany, are made with a Sangiovese grape. Oh, good Lord, I'm sorry, time flies. Are you all okay? If we go over our time limit, I apologize for that. It's Dylan's fault. So what we're drinking is Brunello del Montalcino. Montalcino is a town in Italy, and the Brunello is it's a Sangiovese grape, but it's unique to that area. Something to do with the soil, something to do with the, it's all that mysterious stuff. Vino Nobile de Montepulciano is another village. Montepulciano is another small town, and their wine is called Vino Nobile because in the Middle Ages, it was a favorite drink of the nobility, of the aristocracy. So it's called the noble wine of Montepulciano. And of course, the most famous grape, the most famous wine that comes out of Tuscany is Chianti. And that's really because of all the English and American soldiers that came up through Italy in the Second World War, and they fell in love with these bottles with the straw holding it together. In the Middle Ages, all bottles were like that, simply because the glass was so fragile. It needed these straw protections. But the wines of Chianti, they decided this is, for a purely marketing point of view, but a very effective marketing point of view, they've carried on doing it. And I'm sure, gentlemen, as many of us can remember, student days when we would have a empty bottle of Chianti with a candle in it to show that we were actually underneath it all decent romantic young men, not ravenous sex fiends. And of course, we all remember Italian restaurants, which always have a bunch of these Chianti bottles hanging from the roof. What I'm trying to say here is that they're all made from the same grape. And an interesting exercise that you might want to do sometime is to buy a bottle of Chianti, a bottle of Vino Nobile de Montepulciano, and a bottle of Brunello de Montalcino, and bring a few friends around, or I can do it all yourself. No, bring a few friends around and try tasting them all and see if you can tell a difference, knowing that they all come from a same small area, the size of South Florida maybe, and they're all made from the same grape. I know that some of you this evening have purchased not Brunello del Montalcino, but Rosso del Montalcino. So that's interesting. The Rosso del Montalcino comes from the village of Montalcino, but they're young vines. So if you're a vineyard owner in Montalcino, you plant your vines, and for the first 10 years, while they're still young, you'll make Rosso del Montalcino. And it has its own appellation. And then when the vines have become mature, then you will start making Brunello. And Brunello can't be released for at least 4 years, whereas the Rosso can be released immediately. So it's a younger wine. It doesn't have so much complexity, it doesn't have so many tannins, doesn't age very well. And in fact, they say that you drink your Rosso del Montalcino while you're waiting for the Brunello to mature. That's the difference between the two. But they do come from the same vines, and of course they are all Sangiovese grapes. I'm going to speed up if you don't mind. My Italian Bulldozer, I'll send you the details on an email when we finish this, is a very, very good read. It's a detective story, but it's set down in Montalcino, and in turn, at the same time that he's telling a detective story, he's also talking about the Italian wine classification. So I think you might find that very interesting, and it's amusing. So basically 7 types of wine. Red wine, they ferment it with the skins on. What's important to understand is that grape juice is colorless. It has no color whatsoever, whether it's from a red grape or a white grape. But if you ferment it, in other words, crush it and then let the fermentation take place with the skins on, you end up with red wine. The color comes from the skin. White wine, they've taken the skin off. And hence the lack of color. For rosé wine, no, they don't mix a little bit of one of the other in together. Rosé wine is made with leaving the skins on for just a short period of time and then taking the skins away, just enough to give it the color. Sparkling wine, they used to call it champagne everywhere in the world where they made it. Now, basically what they do is they ferment the wine, interrupt the fermentation, put it in the bottle. The fermentation is still going on, so the yeast is still attacking the sugars, so the sediments are still falling down. They hold up the rack the bottle like this, and eventually, when the fermentation stops, they freeze the neck of the bottle, pull it out, put in this complicated cork here, and that's how a champagne is made. Nowadays, you can only call champagne if it comes from the Champagne area of France. But if you use this method, whether you're in Australia, New Zealand, or California, you can put on your label méthode champenoise, the champagne method. But you do have to follow those very strict things. Your car tire, by the way, when you pump it up, has 30 pounds per square inch. That bottle, any champagne bottle, sustains pressures of 90 pounds per square inch, 3 times as much as your car tire. So that's sparkling wine. Distilled wine, we remember from our school days, I hope. You know, you boil it up, and all the different, whether you're making petrol, whether you're making wine, or whether you're making brandy, the alcohol and the water evaporate at different temperatures, and so you end up with distilled. You start off with wine, and you end up with brandy. The Dutch called it bruntishvin, burnt wine. It's simply the pure brandy from the wine. The more pure alcohol. And fortified wine is when you take that brandy and you put it back into the wine. So, for example, with sherry or port, you ferment the grapes in a normal way. You make the wine in a normal way. With sherry, you usually end up with a 12% wine. You then distill some of that, into they call it, you know, eau de vie and the brandy, put it back into the original wine, and that increases the alcohol level to 18-20%. So that's what fortifying wines are. And appassimento resonated wines, we'll be having one of those in class number 5. And basically, and we'll talk about it in more detail then, but basically, before you ferment, you pick the grapes, put them out in baskets, let them shrivel in the sun and almost turn into raisins, and then, which concentrates the sugars enormously, and then you ferment it. But when we have our Amarone del Valpolicella in class number 5, we'll discuss it in more detail. Wine glasses. My daughter, the Baccarat glass, my daughter works for Baccarat in Paris, and she gave me a pair of these glasses. Actually, this is what I'm drinking from now. The main thing about them, the trouble is they cost $70 each. I'm so terrified of breaking one that I seldom use them. But you can see that I filled it up to here. That's a maximum exposure. That's why it's designed this way. So it gets the maximum amount of air, which is going to, and if I wasn't talking so much, I would be warming it up and helping it to evaporate. It concentrates, and this is typical of all good wine glasses. It concentrates here so that all those aromas which have been released here are coming up, and then, hence my very large nose, that's when I can best taste it. The other thing, the second photograph there is legs. A lot of people talk nonsense about, oh, this wine is really good, it's got really good legs. You know, when you swirl it around and you can, and you see that the droplets coming down the side, it's nothing to do with quality. So if you hear anybody say that, you know that they're talking nonsense. It's simply a matter that 99% of wine is water or alcohol, and alcohol mixed. So when you swirl it around, the alcohol evaporates faster than the water, so the heavier water slips back down, and that's all the legs are. So a highly alcoholic wine, one that's 14 or 15%, will have very pronounced legs. A Gamay, a Beaujolais, for example, if you swirl it around, or a white wine, you'll get very, very little. They're called church windows, they're called legs, but I think, you know, most men like to say, oh, that's got a good pair of legs on it. But that's all it is. It's simply to do with the evaporation of alcohol and water. So very quickly, the first thing you do with a glass of wine, 80% of our perception of taste comes through the nose. It goes to the olfactory bulb, which is up there. The olfactory bulb is just behind your eyes, front of the brain. It's if you eat too much ice cream very suddenly and it's very cold, you get a pain there. That's your olfactory bulb. You've just abused it. It's the most primitive part of the brain, and the very first smell will tell you more about the wine than anything else. The next thing you do, and by the way, the swirling, what you're doing by the swirling is you're exposing it to air. This is what we want to do. The oxygen and the heat releases the aromas, and that's what we want to get from the wine. The third thing you do is slurp. And I'm exaggerating here for the sake of the video. What you're doing, putting a little bit of wine below your teeth, a bit below your tongue, drawing air over it, and that evaporates it further, which again goes up to the olfactory nerve. And finally, the last thing you do is, this is all before swallowing, is sloshing. You're swirling it around your mouth. The reason for that is the inside of your cheeks, the roof of your mouth, your tongue, they all have different sensory perceptions. So by swirling it around, it's tantalizing them all and giving you the biggest sensation. I'm still finding this a little bit tannic, actually. quite often with swirling, and we've been at it now for over an hour, it should have been softer. Again, I'm talking too much, but I'd be interested to hear from you all by email, how you're finding it, how it's changed, because this is something that we should be doing every week, is noting how it changes from the beginning of the class when we first open it and first taste it, to the end of the class, by which time it's matured, the oxygen's got to it, our hands have warmed it, and it should have changed quite dramatically. So the difference between Old World and New World wines, as I said, rather pompously and repetitively, we've been growing wine, and next week we'll see in the history of wine, we've been growing wine in the Old World for 9,000 years, but we've been consciously growing wine and documenting it for 3,000 years in Europe. We do have vineyards in the south of Spain, for example, which have been going for over 3,000 years and documented all the way. The other thing about Europe is the climate is milder than most other parts of wine growing parts of the world, and the rainfall is less predictable. And so one year we get a lot of rain, another year we don't get much rain, and we are, on the whole, dependent on Mother Nature for the watering of our vineyards in Europe. And that's why different vintages are so important in Europe. You know, 1965, a lot of rain, it was great. 1966, a lot of sun, not enough water. And that's why the vintage, and by the way, the vintage that you see on the label, just get this straight, always refers to the date, the year that the grapes were picked. It doesn't mean when it was bottled, it doesn't mean when it came out of the cellar, it's when the grapes were picked. And that way you can compare all the different wines from all over the bottles from all over the world. That's the date of the harvest. It's less important in the new, and the other thing, because it's less sun in Europe compared to Napa Valley or South Australia, then the sugar content is lower, and that means the alcohol content is lower. So the average alcohol content of a European wine is about 12.5%. Now in the New World, varietal, as we explained, is more important than terroir. In Burgundy, if I had a house, if I was looking out my windows in Burgundy, I would know that all the vineyards were growing Pinot Noir, because that's the only red grape that's allowed. When I lived in Santa Cruz, for example, within 30 miles of my house, there could have been Chardonnay and Merlot and Cabernet and a whole variety. Just saying, oh, I'm in Santa Cruz, wouldn't indicate what sort of vineyards were around me. Whereas if I lived in Tuscany, obviously it would only be Sangiovese. If I was in Burgundy, it would only be Pinot Noir. So varietal is much more important. Knowing what grape you've got is more important. Just to say it's Santa Cruz doesn't tell you what sort of wine it might be. The other thing, hotter climate, therefore more sun, therefore more fruit, more alcohol. So the wines are much bigger, higher alcohol content. The average is about 14.5%. The other thing is, because in Europe they depend on Mother Nature for the rain, in most of the New World, whether it's in California, whether it's in Australia, whether it's even in Chile, they use irrigation. And that means that the farmer himself, the wine grower, is in charge of the supply of water. So he can always make sure that the supply of water is perfect. I know for the past, and it intrigues me, for the past few years there's been a terrible drought in California, and people are not allowed to wash their cars, and they're not allowed to water their lawns. But the vineyards are still haven't been they're still allowed to irrigate with water, except of course this year the fires have done terrible damage. The other final thing about New World wines, we still have a lot of peasant farmers or family-owned vineyards in Europe. very few in the New World, and increasingly the vineyards are owned by large conglomerates. Partly, you've just the practical point of view of you've got to ship vast quantities around the world. And the other thing is, if you want to do, most wine now is sold by Costco or Tesco, or, and if you want to do a contract with them, you've got to guarantee that you can provide continuous thousands of crates of identical wine on a regular basis. And for that you need, so wine is becoming more and more industrialized, particularly from the, forgive me saying, the New World. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think on the whole it's a good thing. It means that for a reasonable price of, we have for reasonable price of money, you get good wines. If you're making bad wines these days, you're going to be out of business. So I'm very optimistic of the future of wine. And finally, I do apologize for taking so long. Oh no, I haven't. Sorry, I have a new watch and it doesn't have numbers, so I'm a bit confused. Why have you got an Englishman talking to you about wine? Why the English? Well, if you remember the beginning of the evening, I told you that the best place in the world to live as a wine lover is Florida, because the Floridians don't produce any wine. In the same way, the British have never been able to grow wine. I mean, the Romans grew a little bit, and there's a bit of a comeback at the moment, I'll discuss in a moment. But on the whole, the English haven't had their own wine, and therefore we have to go and steal it from other people. The 100 Years' War, for example, which actually went on for about 300 years, was really about the vineyards around Bordeaux. And that's what it was all about, because the English needed it for their wine. And we also were very, very important down in southern Spain for the sherry, and in Portugal for port. And if you go to Bordeaux, if you go to Cadiz, if you go in southern Spain, if you go to Porto, you'll find that the big families that still own and control the local wine business all have English names. Warnes and Grays and Irish names, Murphys, because they went down there in the 17th, 18th century really to look after their interests, because they were shipping the wine back to England, and they've stayed there. So they're 100% Portuguese or Spanish or French, but they still have those English names. And for example, in Porto, the port wine industry, which is a vast industry, spans the globe, and we'll talk about that in class number 5 or 6. The place where all the decisions are made is called the English House. It's right there in Porto, and all the people are speaking Portuguese, but that's the English influence. Champagne, I'm sorry, Dom Perignon, you did not invent champagne. The English invented champagne. It's a long story. It's to do with, if you remember the map I showed you, the degrees away from the equator, Champagne is the most northerly part of France that's producing wine. Consequently, back in the 18th century, the bottles were always exploding, because what would happen, the winter would come in and it was cold, so the fermentation would stop. And then when the spring came, and the bottles in those days were much more fragile, the bottles would explode. It was very, very, because the fermentation would start again. So the French decided, well, the English, they drink anything, who knows? So they shipped it over to the English. And the English had, in the meantime, discovered a better way of making glass. So they had stronger bottles, and they also were making cider, which is, fermenting. So they discovered the secret of making champagne out of what the French were rejecting. Argentina, it was an Englishman crossing the Andes, actually building the railway from Santiago to Buenos Aires, and he planted Malbecs up above 5,000 feet up in the, God knows why, but he was an engineer, but it worked. And of course, it was the English who took the vines out to Australia and created what is possibly one of the, what's going to be, and the Australians certainly want it to be, the most dominant country in the world of wine. 70% of all wine traded around the world is to England. 20% of all the money spent on wine in the world goes to England. We are still a little country. One of every 6 bottles, where it's traveling in a boat or on a plane, one of them is going to England. Tesco is the world's biggest dealer in wine. And it all comes down to the fact that we never grew any wine. So if you go back to history, Charles II, for example, in the 17th century, and your friend George III, both we have their cellar books where they recorded the wines they were drinking. And we have wines from Burgundy and Bordeaux and Champagne. We have wines from Portugal, from Madeira, port. They called it sack. Shakespeare called it sack from sherry. And if you think about it, the English are big consumers, and therefore if you're growing wine in Spain or in Germany in the Middle Ages, you're definitely going to sell it to the locals. There's no problem. But if you can sell it to export it to the English, then that's great. And therefore the English taste and the English preferences became very, very, very important. And what's funny now, I know that here in South Florida, our ex-governor says we're not allowed to talk about climate change, but I've heard it really is happening. And one of the effects of climate change is that global warming is moving the temperatures further and further north. So, for example, there is increasingly, and we're going to talk about the wines of Burgundy in a couple of weeks. And the wines of Burgundy, some of the most expensive in the world, really depends on that magical heat during the day and coolness at night. Well, but not too much heat. Pinot Noir, which is the grape of Burgundy, is very, very delicate, very, very difficult. And they are genuinely worried that in 20 years' time, that balance of heat and cool will have moved north. And already, I mentioned that Champagne is the most northerly part of France for growing wine. And as we'll discuss in class number 6, I think, when we look at Champagne, the Champagne growers now are buying land in the south coast of England, which has the same soil, same chalky soil, and are actually, they're not allowed to, even though the French companies, Moët Chandon, for example, are planting vineyards in southern England, but they're not allowed to call their product Champagne. We're calling it English fizz. But it's winning prizes all around. So maybe if I'm around long enough, we'll be having specialized evening on English wine. We haven't got there yet, but English Champagne is becoming very, very respectable. So we've had our first hopefully successful Zoom class. And Dylan has been reasonably well behaved. I was hoping he would sit over there and be cute, and but he hasn't. What I'm going to do at the end of the class is send you all these PowerPoint slides that I've sent you. That you can look over them while you finish off the bottle of wine. And I haven't. I've got to be honest. Let's be fair to the wine, because I'm so busy talking. I haven't really. So I'm looking forward to really savoring this. It's improved already. So expect an email from me within the next 10 minutes. And otherwise, I will see you next week. Now, how do I turn all this off? Dylan, out of the way. There we are. And hopefully next week I'll be able to communicate a bit better with you, and you'll be able to respond here. And but please do feel free to send me suggestions, advice, no complaints, how we can make this better next week. And now I can't see all of you at the same time, unfortunately. I was hoping that I would have the whole screen filled. But anyway, be safe. See you next Monday. And cheers.